Can you do this?
Clap?
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Got to go back to school. That's the only chance you have. You're not too old. You can start again. You can pull yourself out of it, which I think you're on the way to doing, and try to figure out some plan for your life. Or you can go right back into it.
The film started with the image of a man on house arrest, so on home detention, unable to leave his home, navigating the world through the telephone, the internet, the windows, living with his father. That was an important sort of starting point for me. So I lived with my father as an adult, and I wanted to capture that dynamic. But it was really the image of a man with a literal shackle, with a ankle bracelet on, in chains, if you will, that struck me and stayed with me, and that was the real starting point. Originally in the script, the character was on house arrest for a bit longer, maybe a couple of months, and more. He was detained for more of the film, but I became interested in what happens afterwards and how he navigates his community once he's free, relatively. There's a lot of men incarcerated in Baltimore, and I've known quite a few. There's also a lot of people. I can't think of anyone whose lives haven't been touched by drugs. And so the illegal economy, if you will, is a big part of sort of life in Baltimore. And everybody's engaged in it in one way or another, I think. At least those of us kind of in the middle class. And so I think it's an interesting way to explore alienation, disenfranchisement, which were themes that I think resonate throughout the U.S., but are palpable in our city.
How long you been out?
Just got done 9 months home detention.
You need work.
Who let the dog out?
Remember your family, dog. We was there for you on the inside. We here for you on the outside.
Yeah, I know.
This ain't no buffet. You don't just dip in and dip out.
Casting this was an interesting process, a little bit different for me. I worked with a casting director for the first time, based out of New York. And we worked with her to secure, probably 10 or 12 of the major supporting roles. We went out to McCall Lombardi because we'd heard about his work on Andrea Arnold's American Honey, and I liked his look. I found out he was from Baltimore, so he seemed perfect in many ways. And then we met, and in fact, he was really bright and excited about the material. He'd read the script. He was from a neighborhood not far from where I grew up, and I could tell he had a passion and discipline, even though he hadn't at that time been in a lot of films. Jim Belushi came through my agency, ICM, which is the talent agency I work with. They gave us a bunch of names, and his stuck out because of his working class roots in Chicago, the fact he's a father, the fact that he's been touched, his life has been touched by drugs, and so yeah, we hit it off. It was a Skype call initially. He was in California and I was in Baltimore, but he'd watched my previous films and loved the script, and I knew that I wanted to work with him right away. I felt that although Jim was not from Baltimore, he understood the world. It was clear after talking to him, and I thought that Jim and McCall's relationship was really solid. McCall is like close in age to Jim's own son, and Jim could relate to Keith's experience, and also Jim has just such a breadth of experience as an actor. There was a sort of inherent mentorship happening on set. McCall was learning a lot from Jim, and Jim was very generous in the process.
You know the problem with you, Keith? You don't want to hear anything that makes you feel guilty.
YGG taking over the whole fucking world, I promise. Understand, don't fuck around. If you not fucking, bitch, don't come around. I keep that magic stick just for you clown. In Baltimore, that's my fucking town.
I was thinking about parts of Baltimore where my grandparents lived. My grandfather worked for the steel mills, and we shot in an area that was built by Bethlehem Steel, the steel company in Baltimore. My grandmother lived in the area as well for a number of years as a child before she met my grandfather. And I was interested in that history and reconnecting with it, also in the maritime tradition there. So it was interesting for me to shoot closer to the water than I had in my previous films. It was a neighborhood that felt distinct in many ways, but also similar to the neighborhoods where I shot Putty Hill and Hamilton. It's a similar milieu. I spent less time in this neighborhood where we shot Saller's Point than the neighborhoods where we shot my previous films. I was less familiar with it, so there was a long period of research, of location scouting, of driving around, looking at buildings, looking at houses, trying to choose what kind of locations we wanted to shoot in. And it was a combination of existing locations, which we barely touched, and then empty locations that we dressed. So for example, Keith's house was a home that we found that was on the market. It was completely empty, there was nothing inside. It gave us an opportunity to to start from scratch and build a world. But then you have a house like the house that he visits Wasp in to go buy a gun. That house looked pretty much as it appears on film. There was very little to do there. We just had to make sure it was safe to shoot in. The factories were locations that we scouted. It was a fun process putting together all the locations in the film. I mean, it's one of my favorite. That and casting are probably two of my favorite parts of production, and both were really, I thought, ambitious in this film. It was a lot of locations, a lot of actors, but of course, finding them all was a pleasure.
How long you lived in this neighborhood?
15 years.
All right, then, well, you should know better. Your father used to work at Bethlehem Steel with my father. This our neighborhood. This ain't up top.
What do you want me to do? Take it easy on you? Hold your hand?
I think of I Used to Be Darker as a melodrama, and this as more of an approach to realism. And there was still a script that took me a couple of years to write, but I was really drawing upon my own experiences and experiences of friends, and the sort of general mood of the city, trying to capture that with some authenticity. I feel very connected to Keith, to the main character in the film. I relate to him a lot. I mean, I was writing from a very personal place, trying to channel my sort of most primal instincts, the more impulsive, aggressive, self-hating side of my personality when I was writing. So I was putting myself in his position and imagining bad choices. And so when I watch the film, I'm frustrated, as I think many audiences are, with Keith and the choices he makes. But I do love him, and I think he has a good heart, and I think that there's hope for him. And so I hope that all resonates with audiences. I mean, I'm hopeful. I think there's still a chance, for him. I mean, things could turn out poorly. He has some challenges ahead, but I could also see him, getting things together more or less, and finding work and a happy relationship, and maybe becoming a father.
If you broke into my house, I'm gonna have to press charges. Well, I don't feel safe. I feel like I have to get a restraining order.
Don't do that, please. Think about his position here. I mean, what are the cops going to do, really?
I tend to write in a very linear way. I don't map out a whole outline for a film before I begin writing the script. I'm doing the character development, some scene work, but once I start thinking about the the story arc. It's very. I write chronologically, so I usually don't know where the film will end when I begin, and I like writing that way. In this case, we had a couple of possible endings. Originally in the script, we follow Keith home after he drives his father's car into the water, and we cut to the next morning, and they're together in the house again. It's a bit like the beginning. They're not talking about the incident, but they've clearly reconciled. We had another ending that we shot where Keith visits his parole officer, who we hear him talking to earlier in the film. And I quite liked that ending, but it seemed a little bit like we were trying to make a social statement, which I didn't want to do at the end of the film exactly. So when we were shooting, the scene where Keith is walking home and passes Courtney on the road, he's left his father's car in the river. I had a feeling that it could be a possible ending as well, and when we were editing, we went with that because it felt like the most honest and also open. We had a test screening the day after Trump was elected, and we tested the original ending for audiences, and nobody really felt like it was appropriate. Suddenly, it was as if everything had changed, and the film took on new resonance. Because if you think about Keith's character, in many ways, he embodies the disenfranchised kind of white working class that put Donald Trump in office, and we don't know what the future is. So that's kind of the idea behind the ending. It's open. We don't know what Keith's future is. He's heading home. He'll probably find the porch light on, and he'll have to talk to his dad, and we can hope that he'll make some right choices and get his life together, but we don't really know. I think in all of my films, I try to leave open endings that allow the audience to carry ideas, out of the theater and into the world, and hopefully keep them thinking. And this felt like the ending that achieved that for me.
Oh, my baby.